Awesome. A lot of what we have here is based on the 5,000-year leap. And if do you have that book we
It's
could
right
show?
here. Oh, we don't have a screen thing though. There's
Oh,
all
yeah,
they're
no
saying is that
screen.
Skousen wrote 5,000-year leap to explain why mankind took a 5,000-year leap forward in progress, when at the time of the founding, men were pretty much living the same way they did at the time of Christ. And he said it was because of what happened when freedom was unleashed on the world. So he's just an impeccable constitutional scholar. I mean, to think that he read 100 volumes of the founders and the stuff that the founders read and their letters and their biographies and speeches is
We
really
can't recommend
impressive.
that book highly enough.
It's the primer, and it's where we got these principles from.
Yeah.
He cataloged them, and really we have learned as we've studied them, they're all statements of natural law. We talk about natural law in principle 1, but all of them have a test and measurable cause and effect attached to them, really.
And they're, I found them in the scriptures all the time, all over the place. So we're hoping that as you read and study these things, you will be able to see why this principle matters, why it worked before. Like it's always works in history. It's
And
like
why we're having problems now because we've departed
from it. And hopefully when we look to see where the departures are, it's not about the political party, but just about the principle.
Yeah.
What is the principle? Because everybody has violated it. There's been
all parties, all candidates, right?
Yeah.
One other thing you should know too, just really quickly, it doesn't matter what member of what church you might be on, or if you belong to a church, but we're members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And the reason we mention that is not that we are here to proselyte or anything, but our church is uniquely American because it was founded here. It's actually a relatively young church. And so we have church leaders that have said things about the divine nature of the Constitution and the inspiration behind the founders' work. So when we felt like it applied to the principle, we added it. So it's not doctrinal as much as we just love that it supports these principles. So you can see an American founded church could see how important these principles are. So the first place we want to start is to just clear up what people think of as left and right. I remember hearing people talk about far left and right in college, and the founders wanted to put something in between what they called far left to be tyranny. They called it ruler's law, or what they found to be no law at all on the far right, which they would call anarchy. So whenever anybody thinks that I'm far right because I'm a constitutionalist, I kind of chortle a little bit, because I don't want to sleep with a club or a sword or a gun or something the way you have to in the time of anarchy to protect your property. The People's Law, what they were shooting for was something with a little bit more federal structure than their original Articles of Confederation, but where they wouldn't control your entire life.
And so if you are somebody who loves the Constitution, is trying to strive to maintain those principles, and you're called far right, then that kind of tells you
that person just wants more government control.
Yes,
really.
How far away we are from those principles. So this is a power structure for ruler's law. And if you look at it at the very top, all the power is in the ruler, okay? And then you go clear down to where the individual has very few rights at all. And Skousen wrote about this, kind of basing it on the Anglo-Saxons. They were somebody that Jefferson studied, and they had come to this place where they understood the difference between these two things. And so here,
very little decision making at the bottom.
Yeah, there's no decision making. So the authority under ruler's law is nearly always established by force or violence and conquest. All the sovereign power is in the conqueror or his descendants. People aren't equal. They're divided into classes. The government power is from the top down. People have no unalienable rights, and government is by the whims of men. Laureen likes to say, off with your head. And the ruler issues the edicts, interprets, and enforces the law. It's all with one person.
Or group, a small group of men. That's what an oligarchy is.
Problems are always solved by issuing more edicts, more regulators, charging the people for these services. I always think about Harry Potter, if any of you are fans, and what's her name? The one
Dolores
I don't like. Dolores Umbridge is just putting
hanging
up
the edicts
more
on the wall.
Edicts all over the place. Freedom is never looked upon as a viable solution to anything.
Well, because it's messy and it can't be controlled.
Yes. And the long history of ruler's law is one of blood and terror.
That's Skousen's commentary, which is Just
True.
he's quite poetic sometimes in his expression.
And the lot of the common people is one of perpetual poverty, excessive taxation, stringent regulations, and a continuous existence of misery. And if you look to history, you will see that. But
Now,
if you
tip that.
have people's law, okay, the Anglo-Saxons considered themselves a commonwealth of free men. All their decisions and the selection of leaders was by the consent of the people, and they tried to get a full consensus, not just a majority. Laws were considered natural laws given by divine dispensation. Power was dispersed among the people and never allowed, and this is key, to centralize or concentrate in any one person or group. So they were organized into small manageable groups, tens, 100s, 1000s.
They would have thought it madness for someone far away from their small group to make decisions for them.
Yeah. The rights of the individual considered unalienable and cannot be violated without risking the wrath of divine justice, because that was the law to which they looked. The system of justice was structured on the basis of severe punishment unless it was complete reparation to the person who had been wronged. And there were only 4 crimes against the whole people. They always attempted to solve problems on the level where the problem originated, and accused persons were presumed to be innocent until proven guilty. So you have to decide where on the scale we are in America now, if you feel like all the power is with the individual or if most of it resides with the government.
Those triangles are a good visual
Yeah.
to get that. Hamilton wrote in the Federalist Papers, number 9, and we'll talk about where the Federalist Papers come from later. He refers to and I love this, this is poetic to me as well, sensations of horror and disgust, which arise when a person studies the histories of those nations that are always in a state of perpetual vibration between the extremes of tyranny and anarchy. And I have to stop there and just explain what he's talking about, because it keeps coming up in this class as we go on. There is like a pendulum that swings between the human condition, or between those two extremes in the human condition historically. Since the dawn of time, there has either been one or the other, and they actually are neighbors. They're actually friends. They're actually in league with each other, because tyrants use anarchy. So that pendulum swings, and when it swings far enough to the right and there is no law and order and people can't predict their life and they're not safe, here comes the strong man that's going to protect them and restore law and order, but he always takes more. And so then there's too much tyranny and that pendulum swings back to the left, and then people rise up and revolt, and that's what revolutions are about. And then it swings the other way. So that's what the founders were trying to do, was push something right in the middle. They were like a wedge
To avoid that.
To avoid that swinging. And so I just love these, that you can get that image in your mind as we talk about these things. Franklin warned, now these quotes mean that it was in the book. So this is Skousen talking again. Franklin warned of this danger when we sow the seeds. Now this is Franklin. Sow the seeds of contention, faction, that's groups or parties, and tumult by making our posts, I don't drink soda while I read this next part, by making our posts of honor places of profit. I'm just going to let you sit
We can
with
talk
that.
more about that in a minute. So the Articles of Confederation nearly cost the colonies the war.
Because it was too far right.
Yeah, there wasn't an executive, there wasn't a judiciary, and there were no enforcement powers. So the states became bitterly divided, and the continental dollar was inflated almost out of existence. The economy was deeply depressed, and rioting had broken out. And then New England had threatened to secede, and England and Spain, of course, were standing close by because they're like, this country is never going to make it, ready to snatch up the disunited states at the first propitious opportunity.
So that was the state of the Union, and it was a loose union at this point because every one of those states considered themselves sovereign states. So the Constitutional Convention convened in May of 1787, and the goal was to try to have a consensus so that everyone wanted the same things. There were only 3 issues that required compromise. So when everyone acts like that is the great goal today, and they nearly genuflect when they talk about how important compromise is, if you're going in 2 different directions, you can't do that. But the reason it worked with these men is because they were going in the same direction at that time. And the only things they needed to compromise on was slavery, to protect the fact that it was even going to become a country in the first place, the proportionate representation, which actually is tied to slavery too. We can talk about that later too. And the regulation of commerce within the states, between them. Skousen said extreme patience was used to bring the minds of the delegates into agreement rather than simply force the issue to finality with the compromise. For example, they took 60 ballots in that convention before they determined that the president would not be democratically elected like the House, that it would have an electoral college, and that's how they were going to do it. 60 times they
They
voted.
went around to try to
Until
make sure
they-
everybody was
And that
happy.
really reminds me, if you are a Latter-day Saint, of the principle of
Councils.
councils. We're gonna work on consensus. That's always going to be the ideal.
So in September of 1787, Congress ratified the Constitution without any changes and sent it to the states. Well, several of the larger states threatened to reject the Constitution. They had issues with different parts of it, but they were invited to ratify the main body of the Constitution, but attach suggested amendments. So
A
just
national
imagine,
suggestion box.
here we go. 189 suggestions were made, but Madison reduced those to 12, and then 10 of them were finally approved and ratified by the states. And what is that called? I ask you?
We need the Jeopardy music right
Yeah.
there.
The Bill of Rights. And I would just ask everybody that's on to just consider how many of those they can name. We don't have to do it here.
No, there will be no quiz,
But
but it's a good question
it's
to
a good
rhetorically ask
question.
yourself and check yourself to see how much you know.
There was one newspaper article I read that said 1 in 1,000 people can name the 5 rights in the First Amendment. So something to ponder.
So when they set the country up to be a united state, so it was a confederation of states, they decided on the eagle, which, and just parenthetically, I think it's adorable that Benjamin Franklin wanted the turkey. He thought it was so noble. But they chose the eagle, and look at this beautiful seal. It really represents all the parts of our government. The 2-headed eagle is the 2 houses of our legislative body. Then a head facing either way for executive and judicial branches. And here's my favorite part. They have a left and a right wing so that they soar evenly, but look what's in the talons. There are arrows to say we are prepared for war, but there is an olive branch in the other one saying, but we want peace. And we know we can only be in peace if everyone knows we are prepared for war.
So the founders warned against the drift toward the collectivist left, okay, because they understood human nature and they had studied so many different civilizations. They warned against the welfare state. They warned against confiscatory. Thank you. Taxation.
And isn't that interesting that they believed that taxation was
That's right.
confiscatory? They aren't talking about just certain kinds are confiscatory. They thought that's what the nature of taxation.
They warned against deficit spending.
Again, hope you weren't drinking soda.
Yeah. So you think about those things, and then this is just something that I actually put together for my kids when I was homeschooling. So this does not come from the book, but I tried to teach them this, and Laureen wanted me to include it. And it's just, why does the size of government matter?
It's just so good to see a visual. If people can understand this, they can see why what we're doing isn't sustainable and we can't continue it.
So in the private sector, that's where you have all the creators of wealth. That's where your business people are, your entrepreneurs. That's where our free market that we used to have exists, and that's how we would gain wealth, okay? Now, the federal government needs to be powerful, but it's limited to defense and foreign relations.
That really was primarily it.
That is primarily it when you study the Constitution, but it doesn't produce wealth, right? It doesn't do anything. It doesn't produce any wealth. The only way it funds itself is through taxes.
So this group has to be bigger. It has to be. If it was smaller, it won't work.
And so this is what George Washington had in the first cabinet. He had 4 cabinet members, okay? He had the Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of State, of War, and the Attorney General, and that's all he had. And it said, I read this interesting statistic, that there were 350 civil servants for 3 million citizens at the time, okay? Now, what happens when the government gets bigger? First of all, we lose some of the creators of wealth over to be employees of the federal government. Or we have to increase our taxes. And then there were 10 cabinet members under FDR. So I won't read them, but these are the ones that were added to the last
Among them,
list
yeah.
that we had. Okay. And then the government continues to grow. And so we require more taxes.
And get eerily close to the same size, notice.
Yeah. And we're not.
And yeah.
We're not. But this is just the visual. But financially, We may be. There are currently 15 cabinet members, okay? And the article I read said to adjust for population, if we wanted to just provide the same services that were provided under George Washington, we would need about 26,000 civil servants, okay? But what we have is just shy of 3 million, okay? Because now we have all of this added to the other, okay? And so the problem is when the government exceeds its constitutional bounds, what you have are the government becomes filled with unelected lawmakers. They're all over here, okay?
In cubicles,
In
making
cubicles.
decisions. You can't get rid of them at the ballot box.
Yes, they're not somebody that you can unelect. You can't stop it. And so you start to be run by not only executive orders from the president, but from all of these unelected lawmakers. And if you maybe just read in the news recently, and I'm not going to go over it, but there are a lot of things that just happened that maybe they probably won't be in the news, where we lost a lot of our rights from somebody within these divisions, one of them being the education department.
We've come to learn that when people talk about the deep state, as we would listen to people act like that was this wildly conspiratorial theory of what was going on in the government. But we've learned from studying this that that's what people mean about this. Deep state it's so deep you can't get rid of it. It's not like it's eerie and big, behind closed door. There's plenty of things that happen behind closed door, but it's more to speak to. You can't get rid of these people. They've got tenure, some of them, they've got pensions, they've got retirements, they've got health benefits and salaries. It's the worst kind of money laundering to take care of problems with bureaus of people who can never be touched. They're just permanent fixtures of the government. And it doesn't matter who's in power, which party is in power, their agenda just keeps rolling forward. Now, this is one of our church leaders that we just.
But he was Secretary of Agriculture.
Yes, he was the under Eisenhower, and this was just so germane. We wanted to include it. Government can give you nothing but what it takes from somebody else. A government big enough to give you everything you want is big enough to take everything you've got, including your freedom.
Thomas Jefferson said, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be, which is true. And you can test and measure that. He said, preach a crusade against ignorance. Let our countrymen know that the people alone can protect us against these evils of misgovernment. And that's kind of why we're doing this class, and why we started studying it, is because it really is the people that are going to solve the problem, not those who are elected. And so we've got to become more educated.
So we wanted to talk, first of all, about just as we go into these principles, what are principles? And I've heard people really kind of scoff at that. Like, you have to be able to compromise principles, not when you're going in two different directions. If you're going towards the left and complete government control, the word that Thomas Jefferson uses is you need to be jealous of your rights and go, hey, no further. So it's important to know what these principles are before we start. So Richard Scott, another one of our church leaders, I loved this. As you seek spiritual knowledge, and of course, I think that's any kind of knowledge, but he's talking about spiritual knowledge to know things of God. Search for principles. Carefully separate them from the detail used to explain them. Principles are concentrated truth, packaged for application to a wide variety of circumstances, as in will be exceptions, but we don't make the rules on the exceptions. A true principle makes decisions clear, even under the most confusing and compelling, and I would add emotionally laden circumstances. It is worth great effort to organize the truth we gather into simple statements of principle. That's how you can override an emotional laden circumstance with principles.
George Mason, who was one of the founders, said, no free government nor the blessings of liberty can be preserved to any people but by a frequent recurrence to fundamental principles.
So with that, we're going to go through these principles. Cleon Skousen talked about these 28 being what we're going to need for maximum freedom, maximum prosperity, and maximum peace. And we have learned that departing from them leads to the exact opposite: bondage, poverty, and war. So the first principle really does talk about natural law, and it says that the only reliable basis of sound government and any kind of just human relations, just even on an individual basis, is natural law, which really is the stating of the first and second commandment, frankly, is to honor the Creator and to know that you're going to treat your neighbor with the same way you want to be treated.
Cicero was somebody who lived just before Christ was born, and he was somebody that was trying to hold up the Roman Republic. He could see that it was going to fall. He was sending out warnings, and he was later assassinated for his voice. And
the founders all read him.
Everybody read him, yeah. And he defines natural law as true law. He said it is of universal application. It's unchanging and everlasting. So when you talk about natural law, you're talking about the laws that always apply, that they're not changing, and it doesn't matter who's in office. This is a natural law. Like if the ball goes up, the ball's going to come down.
If you plant an apple tree, or an apple seed, you're going to get apples.
It summons to duty by its commands and averts from wrongdoing by its prohibitions. And I always told my kids, thou shalt and thou shalt not. It is a sin to try to alter this law. We cannot be freed from its obligations by Senate or people. So we can't just,
legislate it
away, even though people do it all the time, but you won't be able to legislate the consequences of departing from this. This is
again, two of our church leaders that we just thought says exactly the same thing. Go ahead.
Yeah. And so Russell M. Nelson said, remember, sin, even if legalized by man, is still sin in the eyes of God. And that's who we're really accountable to. Man's laws cannot make moral what God has made immoral. We need not look out.
This is still Cicero.
Yeah, this is still Cicero. We need not look outside ourselves for an expounder or an interpreter of it. And the thing that stood out to me about this comment is, back in the Dark Ages, that's exactly what happened. They didn't have the written word to look at their own scriptures. Only the
priests
and stuff had it. And so the king was telling you, the Pope was telling you, so they could manipulate people easily. But once we got the written word in our hand, once we had the scriptures, that's when people began to, have the Renaissance or whatever.
Yeah, the Great Enlightenment, yeah.
And so you got to think about that now. Do we need interpreters of our laws? Do we need thousands of attorneys to tell us what they say? Well, even the congressmen don't really know what they say. So
we've gone backwards hugely in this area, because now everyone thinks they've got to listen to an expert instead of figuring out things. It used to be considered, you could figure out what self-evident was with your own brain power and your own research, but now we're going back to experts similar to the Dark Ages.
Cicero said, one eternal and unchangeable law will be valid for all times. God is the author of this law, its promulgator, and its enforcing judge. And he did have a different idea of the gods, but this is what he said, and I concur.
Yeah.
But
he was
a thinker.
I think he was more of a monotheist, though, if I remember right.
I mean, he believed in them, but.
And this one's really great.
Whoever is disobedient is fleeing from himself and denying his human nature. And by reason of this very fact, he will suffer the worst punishment. And we thought, what exactly
we weren't sure what that even meant.
But Cecil B. DeMille kind of gave us the answer when Laureen found it and called me. And so we've included him, but I have found it in my scriptures many times.
Over and over. Then. I just wrote a blog about this. I've got a website, and I just wrote a blog about this because I love this so much. And I wish I could remember where I came across it, but this is something to remember. If you want to look up that whole speech, you will not be sorry. This commencement address, he got an honorary doctorate from BYU just months after the release of the 10 Commandments. So he spoke at BYU's commencement in 1957. Some who do not know either the Bible or human nature may see in the orgy of the golden calf only a riot of Hollywood's imaginations. But those who have eyes to see will see in it the awful lesson of how quickly a nation or a man can fall without God's law. Notice it doesn't matter if it's a nation or an individual, is what he's saying. If man will not be ruled by God, he will certainly be ruled by tyrants. And there is no tyranny more imperious or devastating than man's own selfishness without the law. It just paints such a picture. And now here's the thing that reminded us of that Cicero statement at the end. We cannot break the 10 Commandments. We can only break ourselves against them. or else by keeping them rise through them to the fullness of freedom under God. God means us to be free with divine daring. I love that. He knows it's going to be a mess. With divine daring, he gave us the power of choice because that's how we learn. Isn't that great?
So Neil Maxwell said, it is important to understand that obedience is not simply a requirement of a capricious God who wants us to jump hurdles for him for the entertainment of the royal court. It is really the pleading of a loving Father to you and me to discover as quickly as we can what we will discover eventually, that there are key concepts and principles that make for happy survival in a planned but otherwise cold universe. All that he's given us and these natural laws and his divine laws is to protect us and bring about the greatest happiness we can have in this life.
More than any other thing that we have studied, natural law has been like a Rosetta Stone for the scriptures for us. It has changed my understanding of the nature of God. It has changed everything because I understand that what he's talking about, a planned but otherwise cold universe. Legislation in violation of God's natural law is a scourge to humanity because it's like trying to violate the law of gravity.
And that is what the founders said. The founders said there should be no laws that are contrary to natural law.
In fact, they said, go ahead.
Yeah, but this is Cicero again, and he said, but the most foolish notion of all is the belief that everything is just, which is found in the customs or laws of nations. So just because it's written there doesn't mean it's just.
Well, thus saith the Nazis.
Yeah. What of the many deadly, the many pestilential statutes which nations put in force? These no more deserve to be called laws than the rules a band of robbers might pass in their assembly. For if ignorant and unskillful men have prescribed deadly poisons instead of healing drugs, these cannot possibly be called physicians' prescriptions. Neither in a nation can a statute of any sort be called a law, even though the nation, in spite of being a ruinous regulation, has accepted it.
That's pretty strong. So, therefore, the law of the Creator is the distinction between things just and unjust, which inflict punishment upon the wicked and protect the good. And this really can be a litmus test for policymaking. The best laws that adhere to natural law disincentivize the worst of human behavior and incentivize the best of human behavior. Likewise, flip that coin. The worst policies incentivize the worst of human behavior and disincentivize the best. You can test and measure that, and it is with 100% accuracy. You will get it right if you use that as your test and measure, if you use that as your yardstick.
So that leads us to principle number 2. A free people cannot survive.
Time out.
Okie dokie.
Cindy, as we finish the principle, what is happening in the nether sphere?
Thanks for checking. I am not seeing any comments or any questions coming up. So you guys are doing an awesome job. Just keep going.
It kind of feels like we're taking all the oxygen out of the room. So I had to stop for just.
That's okay.
You guys are the best sports. How you doing, everyone?
Going. Yeah. And
we'll keep going.
Okay, so a free people cannot survive under a Republican Constitution unless they remain virtuous and morally strong. You will see this everywhere. If you study history, you will see this everywhere in the scriptures, which really is history, thousands of years of history, that unless you remain virtuous and morally strong, you really cannot remain free.
And this principle describes why. It totally explains why. At the time of the revolution, there were doubts among the founders. Many feared that they might not be even good enough for independence. Are we even capable of self-government? Thomas Paine pointed out that most Americans were, now, again, don't drink soda right now. Because what goes around comes around. You know, the thing about everything gets repeated. He feared he said most Americans were industrious, frugal, and honest. So he thought that we could handle it. He added few Americans had been corrupted with riches the way the people had been debilitated in Europe, where all they wanted was luxury, indolence, amusement, and pleasure. That's one of the reasons that those who wanted to break from England wanted to with a sense of urgency. They were worried they would be corrupted like England if they stayed connected to them.
And so you have to ask yourself where we are on that scale now. So, according to Skousen, many Americans became extremely self conscious about their lack of public virtue, which is, I think, maybe what we're starting to do now because of non involvement in the affairs of government. They began to acknowledge their obsession with self interest, the neglect of public affairs, and their disdain for the needs of the community as a whole.
And even if it's not disdain, very often it's just disinterest. Yeah. So again, like I mentioned, this moral reform and this sense of are we good enough really accelerated the revolution. So by 1776, it had become increasingly evident that if they were to remain the kind of people they wanted to be, they must become free of Britain. The calls for independence thus took on a tone of imperativeness, only separating from the British monarch and instituting republicanism, which meant those representatives coming together, it seemed could realize the social image the Enlightenment had drawn out of them. Some of the finest preaching that happened to bring this sense out was in the 20 to 30 years prior to the revolution.
Benjamin Franklin said, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. And you
just like DeMille said.
Yeah, and you can see that just in your everyday life, right? I mean, like, maybe you're not as old as I am, but when I was young, I did not have to go through long, long lines for people to look in my bag and make sure that I didn't have an explosive. You know, I could, even in our church conference center now, you've got to, go through these machines.
All kinds of security.
And you walk out of Sam's and you have to show them your receipt. That never used to happen. But as people become more, as we lose our virtue, then we need more masters.
You have someone to watch.
We try to
have
you. Somebody to say, oh,
well,
let's see.
Maybe as a parent, you've said this to your children if they're going, why do you have to just remind me? Why do you have to remind me every night to brush my teeth? Well, as soon as I see you brush your teeth every night, then I don't have to tell you to brush your teeth anymore. It starts right there. So, do you want to read this one?
Oh, okay. This is a quote that I really loved when I found it. It says, the greatest danger to our liberty today is not religious extremism. And that's, of course, what we're going to, and we're really going to start to hear that. It's a culture of narcissism that cocoons us in vulgarity, distraction, and noise, while excluding God from the human imagination. As the founders knew, and we forget at our peril, the American project of ordered liberty can't work without the support of a moral people, a people formed by a living faith in a loving God.
And this was the Catholic Archbishop who spoke at BYU. Mm-hmm. So this really is kind of a universal principle. And we love this quote of Edmund Burke. He was a British citizen. This was a letter from him to a member of the National Assembly. So this was in answer to some objections to his book on French affairs. Men, and we've never read it, by the way, just so you know. Men are qualified for civil liberty in exact proportions to their disposition to put moral chains upon their own appetites. That's what self-governing is. In proportion as their love of justice is above their rapacity. That's like out of control greed. In proportion as their soundness and sobriety of understanding is above their vanity and presumption. In proportion as they are more disposed to listen to the counsels of the wise and the good, rather than attack them, in preference to the flattery of knaves. Society cannot exist unless a controlling power upon the will and the appetite is placed somewhere. And the less of it there is within, the more there must be without. That's a statement of natural law that can be tested and measured. It's ordained in the eternal constitution of things that men of intemperate minds cannot be free. And why? Their passions are what forge their fetters. That is the word we use for that is vice. Vice is usually considered the opposite of virtue. You're in bondage to your vices, or you're virtuous and you can govern yourself and control yourself.
So the third principle just follows right along, is that the most promising method of securing a virtuous and morally stable people is to elect virtuous leaders.
And is there any question at all on principle 2?
Oh, was there any questions on principle?
No, you guys are doing great.
Okay, we're on a roll.
So Samuel Adams said, but neither the wisest constitution nor the wisest laws will secure the liberty and happiness of a people whose manners are universally corrupt. He, therefore, is the truest friend to the liberty of his country who tries most to promote its virtue. and who, so far as his power and influence extend, will not suffer a man to be chosen into any office of power and trust who is not a wise and virtuous man. And so they're just saying, if we become corrupt, it doesn't matter what is written in our Constitution, right? Because we're
going to
not
have
following.
bad government. Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to have bad government.
And we're going to elect poor leaders. We're not going to pick anybody virtuous, because someone virtuous will
not want to
just
run.
well, for one thing, it will call to our attention the things that we don't want to deal with in weeding our gardens and becoming more virtuous. And so that excuses our bad behavior. One of the things that this chapter discusses that I love that we are really losing today is what Jefferson called a natural aristocracy. And I think you would probably consider this a meritocracy, where the thing that helped you rise in the society was your excellence, your talent, your integrity, your character. Those were the things that elevated you and made people look to you as a leader, rather than whether you were connected, whether you had money, whether you knew someone. So this is what he said: there's a natural aristocracy among men. The grounds of this are virtue and talents. There is also an artificial aristocracy founded on wealth and birth, without either virtue or talents, which is, that he's saying you can do it without virtue and talents if you've got the money, or you're connected and are born into the right family. For with these, it would belong to the first class. It wouldn't matter. Then he goes on, the natural aristocracy I consider as the most precious gift of nature for the instruction, the trusts, and government of society. That is worth pondering. That is a precious gift, to have men who are excellent, so that we can have them as people to emulate, so that we can look to them for leadership. May we not say that that form of government is the best, which provides the most effectually for a pure selection of these natural aristoi into the offices of government. He's positing that's the way we're going to get the best leaders.
So this is I wish I could tell you how much I love this, but it's sad too, because it's like Adam said, what is to become of an independent statesman? One who will bow the knee to no idol, who will worship nothing as a divinity but truth, virtue, and his country. I will tell you, he will not make his own fortune. He will make the fortune of his country. Now, when he
That's why they used to go into public service.
They went into public service to serve, and they didn't come out multimillionaires, but our country rose, and you'll see later, to be the most charitable nation in about 115 years, because we grew so much and we prospered so much. But now you look at our country and we are trillions and trillions. We're printing $1 trillion every 100 days, because that's how far out of control our spending has become. And so our country certainly isn't making a fortune, but the people who are serving in there are going in and spending their life in public service, 45 years. So that's not a big paycheck, and yet they're coming out multimillionaires. So it's something to consider, that this has been turned on its head.
Yeah. So this is Benjamin Franklin, and just notice that this has happened also, like what not to do is how we've flown, or how we've drifted. Sir, there are two passions which have a powerful influence in the affairs of men. These are ambition and avarice. That's greed again. The love of power and the love of money. Place before the eyes of such men a post of honor that shall at the same time be a place of profit, and they will move heaven and earth to obtain it, and I would add, and to keep it. The struggles for them are the true source of all those factions which are perpetually dividing the nation. As all history informs us, there has been in every state and kingdom a constant kind of warfare between the governing and the governed, the one striving to obtain more for its support, and the other to pay less. And this has alone occasioned great convulsions, actual civil wars, ending either in dethroning of the princes or enslaving of the people. Generally, indeed, the ruling power carries its point, and we see the revenues of princes constantly increasing, and we see that they're never satisfied, but always in want of more. The more the people are discontented with the oppression of taxes, the greater need the prince has of money to distribute among his partisans and pay the troops that are to suppress all resistance and enable him to plunder at pleasure. It really is, again, a thing you can test and measure, this cause and effect. If this happens, then and what's fascinating to me about this as we've studied this is because the founders were students of human nature, they recognized this will bring out the best in human nature. This will bring out the worst.
So Noah Webster, if you know Noah Webster's dictionary.
So he was just a little after the
he's
founders.
Just a little bit after the founders, but he wrote about the importance of having good leaders. And one day I was reading in Mosiah 29
in the Book
of Mormon, and they just went side by side. And so that's what we have here is a little side by side. Okay. This is Noah Webster. When you become entitled to exercise the right of voting for public officers, let it be impressed on your mind that God commands you to choose for rulers just men who will rule in the fear of God.
Now, here's the ancient king saying almost identically the same thing at the time of the Nephite refounding. He encouraged the people to appoint wise men to be judges that will judge this people according to the commandments of God.
Noah said the preservation of government depends on the faithful discharge of this duty. If the citizens neglect their duty and place unprincipled men in office, the government will soon be corrupted. Laws will be made not for the public good so much as for selfish or local purposes. Corrupt or incompetent men will be appointed to execute the laws. The public revenues will be squandered on unworthy men, and the rights of the citizens will be violated or disregarded.
Then Mosiah said, he teareth up the laws. He's talking about an unrighteous king. He teareth up the laws of those who have reigned in righteousness before him, and he trampleth under his feet the commandments of God. And he enacteth laws and sendeth them forth among his people. Yea, laws after the manner of his own wickedness. Notice that he changes the laws to support his own agenda. And whosoever doth not obey his laws, he causeth to be destroyed. Thus, an unrighteous king doth pervert the ways of all righteousness.
If a Republican government fails to secure public prosperity and happiness, it must be because the citizens neglect the divine commands and elect bad men to make and administer the laws.
And Mosiah, and if the time comes that the voice of the people doth choose iniquity, then is the time that the judgments of God will come upon you. Yea, then is the time he will visit you with great destruction, even as he has hitherto visited this land. And we have learned for ourselves, as we've studied this more, God is not the destroyer. We are. The reason we're destroyed is because God allows the consequences of our choices. It looks like there was a question on this one.
Okay.
So that was just Tana, and she just said she needed to leave early, and she was just looking forward to the recording. So
thank you, Cindy.
You're welcome.
Okay, so the fourth principle, without religion, the government of a free people cannot be maintained. This principle is a little bit longer for a reason, because it's something that we have been told has no place in government. And so
we have to kind of make the case for it, so to speak.
Yes, because it was amazing to me. I can't tell you, just like all of the things that I always thought were real became real when I read what they said. You know, you just go, well, that makes more sense. I've always thought that, but everybody says, you know, we're not supposed to.
We're not supposed to talk about that.
So we start this one with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 in Article 3. The Northwest Ordinance was written when we were allowing the new states to come in, and they were making laws and trying to say, this is what you need to do in order to become a state. These are the things that you need to do and know. And so in the Northwest Ordinance, they talk about, why do we want schools? What is so important about schools? And this is what they said: religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. Why do we need schools? Because we want good government. And how do we have good government? We have got to have religion, morality, and knowledge. We have to have these three things. This is why we'll have schools.
De Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville was a Frenchman who came to the United States in the 1830s, and the truncated name of the title of the 2-volume book that he wrote was called Democracy in America. He came to observe actually the prison system. But he had lived through some of the tumult in France and went, now, why did it go different in America? So he really had a lot to say about what he saw here and what worked and what didn't. So this is like an outsider's point of view. I very often called Dinesh D'Souza our Alexis de Tocqueville because he came here from another country and observed some of the similar kind of things. So this is de Tocqueville from his Democracy in America. I have known of societies formed by Americans to send out ministers of the gospel into the new Western states, to found schools and churches there. By the way, that's what the Northwest Ordinance was about. That ordinance was to say, this is how people are going to get admitted into the Union as new states, as if they do this. So that's what he is commenting on, is what he saw. Lest religion should be allowed to die away in those remote settlements, and the rising states be less fitted to enjoy free institutions than the people from whom they came. So if they want to have what they left, this is how they've got to do it.
This is Jedediah Morse, and he said, to the kindly influence of Christianity, we owe that degree of civil freedom and political and social happiness which mankind now enjoys. This is why we are happy. All efforts made to destroy the foundations of our holy religion ultimately tend to the subversion also of our political freedom and happiness. In proportion as the genuine effects of Christianity are diminished in any nation, in the same proportion will the people of that nation recede from the blessings of genuine freedom. Whenever the pillars of Christianity shall be overthrown, our present republican forms of government and all the blessings which flow from them must fall with them. And that is another thing you can test and measure. It happens all through the scriptures. It happens all
through history.
That when we recede from these things, and this is God's law, you will lose your freedom. And I just think it's important to think the reason the founders knew that we needed religion in schools is because of our human nature. We must constantly be reminded of God and his commandments, to love him and to love each other, and then we can get along.
Well, that's how they learn. That's how you learn to govern yourself. Back to that thing, if you want to be virtuous, when it talks about having an internal, when Burke talked about having an internal thing to control you or an external thing, you have to have one or the other. The founders knew that religion was one that strengthened the internal. They recognized that. Listen to George Washington. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable support. So picture something being held up by two big pillars. And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion, something very popular today. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness. The only people who disagree with that are people who want to be a law unto themselves and don't want to answer to someone higher. And we're going to talk about that when we get to principle 5.
Well, and Samuel Adams kind of tells you here, I have long been convinced that our enemies have made it an object to eradicate from the minds of the people in general a sense of true religion and virtue. Why? In hopes thereby the more easily to carry their point of enslaving them. They cannot have somebody higher than them. Tyrants, you need to look to the tyrant for all your answers. You cannot look to God. You cannot follow his laws. And I don't know if we have the quote that says that that they know that you can't be governed by somebody who believes in God and follows his laws.
You can't be controlled. Yeah, exactly.
In fact, it's in here.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's going to be so good when we get there. Okay.
I know. Well, we didn't
We always
remember what
forget
we
the
took
order.
out
This is what we
because we
do.
tried to thin.
Yeah. We've been doing this for 12 years.
Yeah.
No, 11. This
Yeah.
is 11 years. It's almost our anniversary.
Well,
Okay.
it's
Anyway.
funny.
So should I do this one?
Sure.
Okay. There must be religion. When that ligament is torn, society's disjointed and its members perish. The nation is exposed to foreign violence and domestic convulsion.
Check.
Vicious rulers chosen by vicious people, that's that violation of principle 3 we just talked about, turn back the current of corruption to its source. Placed in a situation where they can exercise authority for their own emolument, that's their own benefit, they betray their trust, meaning the trust of the people. They take bribes. They sell statutes and decrees. They sell honor and office. They sell their conscience. They sell their country. By this vile traffic, they become odious and contemptible. I love that so much. But the most important of all lessons from Scripture is that denunciation is the denunciation of ruin to every state that rejects the precepts of religion. Now, Gouverneur Morris was one of the original founders again. And so again, the thing that's so unique about our founders is that they were all so commonly read. They had all read those histories, the great writers and thinkers of the day. So that's what, and like I said, there's so many quotes in the book where there's so many more, men that agreed with this. We've just tried to pull some of the ones that are the best.
They didn't pick a certain denomination. Jefferson said, no religious reading, instruction, or exercise shall be prescribed or practiced inconsistent with the tenets of any religious sect or denomination. So it wasn't that they wanted a state-run
religion
or
church.
It's just that they wanted these principles taught.
Which is one of the arguments today. Well, not everybody believes in that, but we'll talk about that too. Pardon me.
So Benjamin Franklin said the 5 fundamentals of all sound religion, and this is what he discovered it was most important to be taught. He said, here is my creed. I believe in one God, the creator of the universe, that he governs it by his providence, that he ought to be worshiped, that the most acceptable service we render to him is in doing good to his other children, that the soul of man is immortal and will be treated with justice in another life, respecting its conduct in this. These I take to be the fundamental points in all sound religion. And Jefferson and Washington and Adams
they all felt
agreed.
the same way. And Skousen, interestingly, when he came across some of this stuff, thought, if that sounds so universal to me, I wonder how universal it is. So he studied other religions and looked to see some of their basic tenets. He said all of the big religions of Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, all had some version of this. How you treat other people is the way you honor your creator. You will be accountable and answer to him how you live in this life. And really, that's basically all of it right there. This is, he's elaborated a little bit more.
We told you a little bit about de Tocqueville, and this is the name. It was called Democracy. We know it as Democracy in America.
But dig the main title.
But the main title is The Republic. It used to bug me that it was called Democracy in America because everybody calls our nation a democracy, which it is not. And I thought, why is it called that? And then I was so kind of excited, I have to admit, when I learned the real name was the Republic of the United States of America and its political institutions reviewed and examined. So you can kind of see why they went to Democracy in America.
And we'll talk about that next week.
Anyway, he talks about the importance of religion. He said, the American colonists brought with them into the New World a form of Christianity, which I cannot better describe than by styling it a democratic and republican religion. This contributed powerfully to the establishment of a republic and a democracy in public affairs. And from the beginning, politics and religion contracted an alliance which has never been dissolved. And we like to say, until now.
The door was supposed to swing to have religious influence in policymaking, but that policymaking was never to go the other direction and influence what happened in churches. And we'll talk about that in just a minute too. And in fact,
and here it is.
Almost this very minute. Because in religious freedom, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, that's not the same as freedom of worship. You'll notice there is this sleight of hand rhetorically in today's dialogue that freedom of worship is what we have. And I heard Eric Metaxas give a speech at CPAC about that and said, no, that's they have freedom of worship in China. And it means you go do your religious practices in your synagogue or your temple or your church or your cathedral, and you come out here and then you shut up about it. So notice where this actually came from, because there's this great big myth about the wall between the church and state, the separation of church and state. You should know that doesn't appear anywhere in any of the organic documents of our country. It was a phrase from a private letter written by Thomas Jefferson in response to a letter that he received in 1802 from the Danbury Baptist Association letter. Now, he would have been the vice president at this time. So they wrote him a letter concerned about this very issue. What if the federal government is going to come and dictate what we do? So this is what Jefferson wrote to them. Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Notice he's quoting the First Amendment there. Thus building a wall of separation between church and state. And in context in that letter, he absolutely meant the flowing of political influence to religion, not religious influence to policy.
Ezra Taft Benson, he was the Secretary of Agriculture we talked about earlier. If Americans should ever come to believe that their rights and freedoms are instituted among men by politicians and bureaucrats, then they will no longer carry the proud inheritance of their forefathers, but will grovel before their masters, seeking favors and dispensations, a throwback to the feudal system of the Dark Ages.
Well, because if you remove God, then it's up for grabs where the rights come from, the source of rights.
So as we talked a little bit about education, not wanting to be void of religion, this is an interesting quote by a humanist, Charles Potter, and he was a signer of the originalist Humanist Manifesto, which is kind of an anti-God document.
And you should know that's in 1930. It's almost a century old that the humanists became a society.
And he said, education is thus a most powerful ally of humanism, and every American school is a school of humanism. What can a theistic Sunday school meeting for an hour once a week and teaching only a fraction of the children do to stem the tide of a 5-day program of humanistic teaching? And sadly, I say not much.
We can say a century later. Then we heard this quote in an actual general conference talk by President Benson, and we looked up this A.A. Hodge, who said this, was a minister, a Christian minister in the late 1800s. And again, see if you cannot test and measure, because this is the wedge that atheists and humanists used to take all religious teaching out of the schools, which was never the intent of the mission of public schools. He said, and it's worth looking up his whole sermon, like I said.
It's very good.
And I think we might have the link to it on our website, which is Liberty. I can't remember the exact name now because it's changed.
We're
so
sorry.
Yeah, I can get it to you in an email though. So he said, it is capable of exact demonstration. And what he's saying there is you can test and measure this. If every party in the state has the right of excluding from public schools whatever he does not believe to be true, then he that believes most must give way to him that believes least. And then he that believes least must give way to him that believes absolutely nothing, no matter in how small a minority the atheists or agnostics may be. It's self-evident that on this scheme, if it's consistently and persistently carried out in all parts of the country, the United States system of national popular education will be the most efficient and widespread instrument for the propagation of atheism which the world has ever seen. And since we have studied the writings of people like Horace Mann, who's considered the founder of modern education or
Thomas
American
Dewey.
education, and then John Dewey, who just took it farther and disseminated it further into the schools, both of them, that was their idea.
Skousen said, thus religion and the American institutions of freedom were combined. The founders had taken the 5 truths we have already identified as religion and had built the whole constitutional framework on top of them. The sanctity of civil rights and property rights, as well as the obligation of citizens to support the Constitution in protecting their unalienable rights, were all based on these religious precepts. We're at principle 5.
Okay, how we doing?
I think we can do 5.
You guys are doing awesome.
We can do all 3.
Do you have any?
Does
Okay.
anybody have any comments or thoughts that they want to share? We'll let them go on to the next principle, but maybe you can share a couple of thoughts that you're having, and that will give us a little bit of interaction.
Yeah. That's the hardest part. There's so much. And
Yeah.
really, that's why we used to need 6 weeks, is because we would talk about these for a little bit. But like I said, we're mindful of your time, and we're hoping we can get through 7 tonight.
This one is the longest.
Yeah.
This night will
or-
be the longest.
Yeah, tonight's the
Yeah.
longest one.
You guys are doing excellent. So keep going.
You're very kind, Cindy. Okay, so this one kind of goes hand in hand. And again, because of this idea that our rights come from God, which we're going to move into in the next group of principles, but we need religion to govern ourselves. And this principle says all things were created by God. So upon him, all mankind are equally dependent. That's why despotism is such an affront to God. And to him, to God, we are all equally responsible. The founders also read Blackstone, who was kind of the gold standard of jurisprudence. Everyone read his commentaries on the laws of England in England. And he said the will of God, which is expressed in the orderly arrangement of the universe, is called the law of nature. And there are laws for human nature, just as surely as they exist for the rest of the universe. The laws for human nature had been revealed by God. So he's talking about scripture, whereas the laws of the universe, which he calls natural law, and someplace else he calls the laws of God, divine law, must be learned through scientific investigation. Upon these two foundations, the law of nature and the law of revelation, depend all human laws.
So the founders are not deists. People say that all the time. And that is like that there was a creator, but he moved away and he hasn't paid attention to us. But they're not deists. They believed in a creator who is both intelligent and benevolent, and therefore anxious and able to respond to people's petitions when they are deserving of needed blessings and engaged in a good cause.
If you read their writings, you can tell that they
Right.
believe in a God that's involved.
Yeah, because George Washington here says no people can be bound to acknowledge and adore, which I love that, adore, the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency. He wrote about this a lot, and they used to study his farewell address in school.
Yeah, that was
Used to
typically
have its
studied.
own book. They took it out of the schools for a while, and when they brought it back,
All
they had
mention of
taken
God was
out
gone.
all the mention of God that was in there. Now they don't even study it, but
And you'll notice that strategy and that tactic is pretty repetitive. Creative vacuum, so there isn't truth to refer to as a standard, and then no one knows it, so they can accept the lies more easily. So now Madison had a similar sentiment when he said the real wonder of the fact that the country became a country. The real wonder is that so many difficulties should have been surmounted with a unanimity almost as unprecedented as it must have been unexpected. It is impossible for any man of candor to reflect on this circumstance without partaking of the astonishment. It's impossible for the man of pious reflection not to perceive it, a finger of that almighty hand which has been so frequently and signally extended to our relief in the critical stages of the revolution. And really, to study that is just a lovely, lovely adventure.
so this, I believe, was also de Tocqueville, might have been. I think it is. He said, and I love this so much. He said, while I was in America, a witness who happened to be called at the sessions of the county of Chester, which is in New York, declared that he did not believe in the existence of God or in the immortality of the soul. So he's a witness that's been called up to the witness stand.
And so when they say, so help you God, he's just saying, oh, I don't believe in God. So the judge says,
so the judge refused to admit the evidence on the ground that the witness had destroyed beforehand all the confidence of the court in what he was about to say. The presiding judge remarked that he had not before been aware that there was a man living who did not believe in the existence of God, that this belief constituted the sanction in the law, which was to give it the binding force of all testimony in a court of justice, and that he knew of no case in a Christian country where a witness had been permitted to testify without such a belief. So there again, we are a Christian nation, and they did believe in God. And so, I've had kids go to school where the professor said, no, they didn't. And my kids have taken these kinds of things and they're like, well, it doesn't matter. They didn't believe. And you're like, oh, okay, I guess not then.
Yeah, I don't agree. Yeah. And so because we are all under God, that God is on a different plane than men, it stands to reason. Then again, self-evident, it used to be self-evident and a statement of natural law that we're all created equal. And by that, we mean we're all equally flawed under God. That's why we all need him, the way it mentioned in that other one. Men are equal in 3 ways, and in other ways they're not, but these 3 are critical in the sight of our Creator, in the sight of the law. Now, see, we have grossly lost that one, and in the protection of our rights, which we've also lost.
John Adams said that all men are born to equal rights is true. Every being has a right to his own, as clear, as moral, as sacred as any other being has. But to teach that all men are born with equal powers and faculties, to equal influence in society, to equal property and advantages through life, is as gross a fraud, as glaring an imposition on the credulity of the people as ever was practiced. We are equal in those other ways, but we will never be equal
In other
in
ways.
other ways.
Some are faster, some are taller, some are stronger. We used to talk about this, but we don't have time. So we wanted to make sure you just knew about this great little story by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. And you can find it online. There's a free HTML file. I used to teach it in junior high school, and it is a fabulous story to talk about what happens. He in the most absurd way extrapolates what if we really did try to make everyone truly equal, and how absolutely futile it is and how absolutely absurd it is. I really recommend that story.
So Skousen talks about minorities, and he said, first of all, it is remarkable that the founders were able to establish a society of freedom and opportunity which would attract so many millions of immigrants.
From all over. the world.
Secondly, it is even more remarkable that within 2 or 3 generations, nearly all of these millions of immigrants became first-class citizens.
They didn't stay in poverty.
And he talks about why. What does it take to cross the culture gap?
So we would want to talk to you about if you're new in a school as the new kid on the block, if you move into a new neighborhood, if you get a new job, you come to a new country. There is a culture in all of those places, and so
it takes a minute
to assimilate into a new culture. Takes a minute. And Skousen asserted that this is what you need to do to come into another country.
You need to learn the English language. You need to attain a general norm of education, become economically independent, become recognized as a social asset to the community. You can go ahead and do this, but this was what was written in the naturalization book in 1919 in New Jersey. What does it take to be an American?
So every person who came and wanted to take the citizenship test got this. An American is a man who is greater in his soul than in his class, creed, political party, or the section in which he lives. So he's not going to divide himself into tribal thinking. He's greater in his soul than all those things he identifies as. To be an American, a man must have an American soul and believe in the spiritual realities upon which America rests and out of which America was born. America was created to unite mankind by those passions which lift, and not by those passions which separate and debase. We came to America either ourselves or in the persons of our ancestors to better the ideals of men, to make them see finer things, to get rid of things that divide, and to make sure of the things that unite. The man who seeks to divide men, group from group, interest from interest, in this great union is striking at its very heart. We kept this in, even though it's not in that book anymore, and no one gets that, because that is chilling to me to read and see why we have some of the problems we have, because there have been people who have done that very thing.
Something that we need to be really cautious of is just not trying to divide each other. You know, I've just seen so much of it. Don't allow people to put you in a group, and don't put others in a group.
Skousen ends this chapter of chapter 6, and I just realized we didn't stop after chapter 5, so we're going to have to take just a minute when we do. But he talks about a fellow by the name of Eldridge Cleaver, who was a Black Panther, was put in prison. And I can't remember, I think he came out for a minute. Yeah, I can see there's some questions there. So we're just going to tell this little quick story, and then we'll stop for some questions or comments. He got out and left the country so he wouldn't have to go back to prison. And he was radicalized, as very often happens in prisons, into communism. So he came out even more militant than he was as a Black Panther going in. So when he came out and escaped, he decided to go to a communist country. So he went to Cuba, and he thought, oh, it's been tainted by Americanism, by the horrible ideas of America. So he went
because it wasn't working.
Because it wasn't working, because communism never works. And so then he went to the USSR, and it was just as bad. And he started to become disillusioned. He kind of went through a powerful conversion experience, which we won't go into. He is a fascinating man, though. But listen to what he says about the conversion experience was so powerful. He came back to the United States, turned himself in served the rest of his sentence, and spend the rest of his life talking about the blessing of being an American. Listen what he says. I was wrong, and the Black Panthers were wrong. We, meaning Black Americans, are, because this was right at the height of the civil rights movement in the 60s, but now this was all these years later. We are inside the system. And see, that's never what you hear about the racism. We are inside the system. And I feel that the number one objective for Black America is to recognize that they have the same equal rights under the Constitution as Ford or Rockefeller, even if we have no blue chip stocks. Our membership in the United States is the supreme blue chip stock, and one we have to exercise. And those who have, agree with him. The Burgess Owens, the Candace Owens,
The one that you should really study is
Frederick Douglass, and Booker T. Washington.
Booker T. Washington, Up
Mhm.
from Slavery. Such a great book. And he talks about this. And he says, even though there were other Black leaders that were saying, you know, we need to be treated differently. And he's saying, no, what we need to do is develop talents. And if we develop talents, there will be no distinguishment between
Yeah.
us. And that was true with him. And now they're trying to call that book a fictional book.
Yes, you
So
get
be
new
careful.
editions of that, and it says in the front that it is a work of fiction, and
Yeah.
it is not.
It's so sad.
He's the man who was the founder of Tuskegee University.
But he runs contrary to the narrative of today, and that's why they need to
Yes.
do that.
So let's take a look at these questions. Oh, we're not quite finished. Forgive me. I thought
Yeah,
we
we're
had gone,
almost
going on to
done.
7.
We just talk a little bit about what can be equal and what cannot. You can have equal opportunity, but you are not guaranteed the results. Equal freedom, but not equal capacity. Equal rights, but not equal possessions. Equal protection, not equal status. Equal educational opportunities, not equal grades. And Alexander Hamilton said, inequality would exist as long as liberty existed. It would unavoidably result from that very liberty itself. Some people are workers. Some people are
Content with less.
they are content with less, and they have different skills. Some people don't try. I mean, it's going, as long as if you want liberty, you're going to know that there's going to be an
There's
inequality
going
of
to be
outcomes.
inequality, but it shouldn't be before the law.
And if you want to take away liberty, then there's going to be equality of misery.
Mhm. Okay, so let's stop there and look and see at our, yeah, I think we can do it because this one's pretty short, but I want to see what our questions are.
Okay, you guys, there was one from Pam. It says, who said that quote about the American soul?
Oh, that was in the that alien handbook that everyone used to get.
It's in New Jersey's Alien Handbook 1919. If that helps, but if we'll make a note and we'll send it
Yeah,
out.
yeah.
Make it-
And I think it's on the website too.
Okay. And then Dawn just wanted to mention that she says she never gets tired of hearing this information from you guys. It's something we should review over and over and over until it is
It
burned
will-
into our hearts and minds. And I agree.
They're lovely principles, aren't they? Amen.
Yes.
Thank you, Dawn.
And then Pam also just said, I agree, this is great. I'd go into an in-person class if it was available in order to have even more discussion together. So
That's
Oh,
awesome.
great comment. I just want to remind everybody to put your email address into the comment section as we're kind of ending here shortly, just so that we can have everybody's email to send.
Yeah, a way to communicate with everyone. Thank
information.
you, Cindy, for reminding.
Okay, well, this will really only take about 5 minutes and we will be done. And that is Principle 7, which the proper role of government is to protect equal rights, but not equal things. So it just follows the other one
Yeah, it was meant to.
perfectly. People cannot delegate to their government the power to do anything except that which they have the lawful right to do themselves. So when you think about this redistribution of wealth, it's like, I can't go to Laureen's garage and take her extra car and give it to my neighbor down the street who doesn't have one without going to prison. And so
my
we
government
can't,
do that. We can't delegate that to the people who work for us.
right.
Sorry, I didn't mean to
No, that's
cut
okay.
you right off there.
Okay.
Go ahead. Should I do this one?
Yeah.
The American founders recognized that the moment the government's authorized to start leveling the material possessions of the rich in order to have an equal distribution of goods, the government therefore has the power to deprive any of the people of their equal rights to enjoy their lives, liberties, and property. See, that goes right back to where do your rights come from? If we get God out of the picture because he's competition to a tyrant, then they say what the rights are and what they aren't, and they
Take
can
them at
take
will.
them away. They can take them away and they act like they grant them.
So those on the receiving end may think it's just to take from the haves and give to the have-nots, because if you're getting it, it sounds awfully good. But they immediately declare with indignation that they have rights in the property the government gave them. The government replies, we decide who has rights in things. And there's an example, a lesson from communism, which is back in Hungary, where at one time the leaders took the property from the farmers and divvied it out to the collective. And that worked out really well for the collective until then they took it all back and made them communal farms. And then the collective was angry and upset. And the government leaders were like, you can shut up or I can kill you. But that's what's happening. And so as
Many went
long
to
as you're the
prison.
one getting it, you're happy. And that's why it's very hard to stop these programs.
Because everyone's got
Because
something in it now.
yeah, now people are getting something, and it takes a lot.
A lot
for
of
you
character to say, I will pay for myself now.
yeah, I will take care of myself.
So Franklin, these are some thoughts that he had about providing for the poor. Compassion can be counterproductive, he felt like. He felt like it was, and this is really all about enabling ideas. Those of you who might know the principle of enabling. It's not a good idea to give a drunk the means to increase his drunkenness. It's not a good idea to do anything that breeds debilitating dependency and weakness. That makes it easier, again, to do that. Anything that makes it easier to do the worst things. It's bad when we blunt anybody's desire to work for a living, anyone, or anything that smothers the instinct to strive or excel. And then he said, to relieve the misfortunes of our fellow creatures is concurring with deity. It is godlike. So he's admitting that is one of the most godlike things we can do, is look out for the suffering of our brothers and sisters. But if we provide encouragement for laziness and supports for folly, see, you learn from your foolishness. So if we support that, you never learn your lesson. May we not be found fighting against the order of God and nature, which perhaps has appointed want and misery as the proper punishments for, and cautions against, as well as necessary consequences of, idleness and extravagance. Great question.
So these are just some highlights from the founder's writings, referring to the calculated compassion. It says, do not help the needy completely, merely help them to help themselves. Give the poor the satisfaction of earned achievement. That's what motivates us, instead of rewarding them without achievement. Allow the poor to climb the appreciation ladder from the tent to the cabin, cabin to cottage, cottage to comfortable houses. Grow. That's how we all did
That's
it.
how we learn in stewardship. That's how we grow in stewardship.
Where emergency help is provided, do not prolong it. Let me pause. Do not prolong it to the point where it becomes habitual. Strictly enforce the scale of fixed responsibility. The first and foremost level of responsibility is with the individual himself, and then the family, and then the church, and then the community, finally the county, and in a disaster or an emergency, the state. Under no circumstances is the federal government to become involved in public welfare. The founders felt it would corrupt the government and also the poor. No constitutional authority exists for the federal government to participate in charity or welfare. The reason we have government is to secure our rights. That if somebody can take our stuff and give it to somebody else, then your rights to property have been violated.
And like it said, it corrupts both the government and the poor. And when this really ramped up, when we became a federal welfare state, was under LBJ and the great war on poverty in the 60s.
And how's that poverty going? How's that war on poverty going? I'm watching commercials that say Americans are starving.
With their cell phones?
Yeah. So Elder Rendlin said, he's a member of our
leaders.
Yeah, and I thought this was perfect. He said, the greater the distance between the giver and the receiver, the more the receiver develops a sense of entitlement.
So not your neighbor doing something for your neighbor.
He's when there's a big distance, it's your check from the government
far
that comes, like it's your paycheck. And he's saying you're not even thinking about it. But if family members and local church leaders are closest to those in need, they frequently have faced the same kind of circumstances. We understand how to help. And because of our closeness, it's my neighbor, to the givers, recipients who receive help, according to this pattern, are grateful and less likely to feel entitled, because we watch our neighbor go to work every day. We see that they're sacrificing to give to us, and we try to get into a better state sooner. And that's a wrap
That's the wrap.
of Principle 7.
That's a really cute slide. That's new. I haven't seen that
I
one.
know. So, thank you all.
Were there any other questions, Cindy?
No, that was it. We're just collecting some email addresses. On
Oh,
Gmail.
awesome.
Awesome.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Perfect.
so
Well, we appreciate those of you who came so much.
Yes.
thank you. You guys did an amazing job. This was my first time hearing this, and so I loved every minute of it. And I want to go back and listen to it. We are recording this, and so I'm going to stop the recording here in just a second.
Okay.
And you guys will, I guess, you'll send out the email with the recording.
Yes. If we can get these emails before we get off tonight, we'll make sure we make a little list and send the recording link.